Okay, I think we'll get started now. So hello and welcome to this evening's event, The Plight of the Uyghurs in China, a Conversation. It's great to see so many people from all over Australia, New Zealand and the world. My name is Galit and I'll be your host tonight. And just before we begin, I'd like to hand over to Rebecca Ellenson, who will be doing the acknowledgement of country.
Thank you, Galit, and good evening, everyone. AUJS and the Jewish Board of Deputies acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand, and their connection to the various lands that we are all meeting on today. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and Maori peoples here today. We also acknowledge that this land is, was, and always will be traditional Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and Maori land. We affirm the mutual respect that has developed between the Jewish people and the Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and Maori people, and the importance of spirituality and the relationship to land. Australia and New Zealand have provided a home for our Jewish community, and we acknowledge our obligation to respect the land on which we live.
Thanks, Rebecca. So first and foremost, I'd like to express our deep appreciation to Stephen Smith and Nury Turkel for joining us tonight and sharing their thoughts and experiences. We're so grateful that you've woken up in the middle of the night to speak with us. And furthermore, a huge thank you to Jewish Board of Deputies who are co-hosting this event with AUJS. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping things. If everyone can try and keep their cameras on, that would be greatly appreciated so our speakers can see all your beautiful faces. And if you have any questions throughout the event, please send them through on the Zoom chat. They'll go directly to our co-hosts, Gabby and Rebecca, who'll be reading them out for Stephen and Nury to answer at the end of tonight's event. In his speech after receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, Elie Wiesel said, "We must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Sometimes we must interfere. When human lives are endangered, when human dignity is in jeopardy, national borders and sensitivities become irrelevant. Wherever men or women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must, at that moment, become the center of the universe." Over the past year or more, increasing evidence has emerged of a campaign by the ruling Chinese Communist Party regime to eradicate the Uyghur cultural and religious identity. At least 1 million Uyghurs have been detained in camps, interrogated and beaten solely due to their religion. As members of the Jewish community, we are no strangers to persecution. Just 75 years ago, we were subjected to unspeakable horrors and atrocities during the Holocaust. In fact, many of us here today are personally connected to survivors and their stories. In light of our history, hearing about the suffering of other ethnic groups is not something we should ever take lightly. Our responsibility towards those experiencing persecution is more than just a reaction to our own history. In Dvarim, or Deuteronomy, chapter 16, verse 20, we're mandated to the pursuit of justice in the immortal lines, Tzedek, Tzedek, Tirdof, meaning justice, justice, you shall pursue. We hope that this event will be the first step of many in pursuing justice for the Uyghur people. Our first speaker tonight is Nury Turkel. Nury is a US-based attorney and the commissioner at the US Commission on International Religious Freedom, appointed by Speaker Nancy Pelosi. He was born in a re-education camp at the height of the Cultural Revolution and spent the first several months of his life in captivity with his mother. Nury is the chairman of the board for the Uyghur Human Rights Project, which he co-founded in 2003. As the president of the Uyghur American Association, he led efforts to raise the profile of the Uyghur people in the United States. He is also engaged in policy and legislative advocacy in the European Union and the Australian Parliament. He has also been a legal and policy advisor to the past and present presidents of the World Uyghur Congress. This year, Nury was named as one of the 100 most influential people of 2020 by Time magazine for his incredible work. So welcome, Nury. Can you hear me?
Yes. Thank you, Galit. Appreciate the warm introduction. I wish we can have this event in person as I had in the past speaking to my Australian friends, but at least we can have this conversation to raise awareness on one of the world's worst human rights crisis of our time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. We really do appreciate you getting up so early and being here with us today. I'd like to begin by asking you, for our audience members who don't have a lot of background knowledge in this area, would you be able to tell us a little bit more about the culture and history of the Uyghur people?
The Uyghur people are the other Tibetans that the world have not or haven't heard until 2-3 years ago. Uyghur people are Turkic, belong to Turkic ethnicity, speaking Turkic language, similar to the ones spoken in Central Asian Turkic republics that include Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. Uyghur people also share cultural, historic, linguistic background with the people of Turkey. The landmass that the Uyghur people call East Turkestan, that China renamed as Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region after occupation, is 4 times the size of California, the size of Western Europe, twice the size of Texas. It's a giant landmass. It has a long international borders with countries including Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Pakistan, and India, of course, China. The Chinese government official estimate, official figure for the Uyghur population is around 12 million. The Uyghurs, both inside and outside of country, believes that the Uyghur population could be anywhere near 20 million, including those who live in the former Soviet republics. As far as the Uyghur diaspora is concerned, there are sizable Uyghur communities in Western Europe, in Central Asia, Turkey, Australia, North America. I would say the most active, politically active community can be found in Istanbul, in Munich, and here in Washington, D.C.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I think that really helped paint a picture for us. My next question for you. The international community has heard reports that the Chinese government has detained up to 1 million Uyghurs, sending them to so-called re-education camps. There have also been accounts of Uyghur women subjected to forced sterilization. Can you tell us a bit more about what is happening at these camps and how things have escalated in recent years?
The Chinese government's repression of the Uyghurs is nothing new. This has been going on as long as I have been breathing. As you pointed out, that I was born at the height of the Cultural Revolution in captivity. Oddly enough, we're talking about a similar type of experience that the Uyghur people suffering in Xi Jinping's China today. Historically, Uyghur people have been subject to various forms of racial discrimination, cultural annihilation, political repression, forced disappearances, but it got taken a very serious turn since 9/11. Initially, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Chinese tried to prevent the Uyghurs gaining international attention, tried to prevent it from becoming a global hotspot. With that mindset, they set up a regional organization called Shanghai Cooperation Organization with Russia and Central Asian former Soviet republics to prevent the Uyghur issue becoming a global issue, particularly on the other side of the border. But 9/11 given the Chinese another excuse to ratchet it up. And then July 5, 2009, there was a peaceful protest that turned into a violent ethnic clash between Han Chinese and Uyghurs and also the police. That made the Chinese to realize starting 2010 all the way to 2017 that carrot and stick policy didn't work. They need to come up with a different type of policy. Now we're seeing as carrot only. Early 2017, the Chinese government, local authorities enacted something called de-extremification measure that sanctioned 48 some of the most commonly accepted, even protected social behaviors, physical appearances that have been part of the Uyghur life throughout the history, such as growing beard, naming children with Abrahamic names, and also encouraging female member of the family to marry someone from the same ethnic, same religious group, and also practicing religion at home even. So they sanctioned the Foreign Policy magazine listed those 48 ways or sanctioned behaviors that could get you into the concentration camp that China called with different names: re-education camp, vocational centers. And then it got really worsened starting summer 2017, at which time they used a technology, a tool called IJOP that was reverse engineered and reported by Human Rights Watch about a year or so ago. That platform not only monitored, collected personal data, built a massive database for monitoring and surveilling the population. They also start rounding up everyone who should be rounded up. As you may recall, New York Times reported some leaked documents in November 2019. There are a couple of lines jumped out at you when you look at it. One is Xi Jinping ordering his enforcers, no mercy, and also the local Communist Party chief who has been sanctioned under the Global Magnitsky Act in the United States, ordered his security officials to round up everyone who should be rounded up. So there's no limitation, there's no process, there's no procedures. As you may know, that China has a criminal law and procedures. They have even counterterrorism law. They didn't even follow their own laws. Counterterrorism law, for God's sake. So this whole thing has been so draconian, so extraordinary, so brutal that implemented, carried out with a very clear slogan, which is these camps to serve to break the Uyghur lineage, connection, and roots. And these camps should be taught like a school, protected like a prison, or protected like a military, and managed like a prison. So they have very specific mindset, and they use the term concentration in Chinese, as reported in the New York Times. That gives us a kind of a sense they had something else in mind when they designed and built, expanded these systems. Whenever people hear the word concentration, it definitely easily remind us of the horrific history of the Jewish people. But the Chinese policy advisors apparently studied very well, modeled Adolf Eichmann's policies, procedures. This person, Chen Quanguo, have been dubbed as Chinese Adolf Eichmann because of his brutal ways of meeting his superiors' exceeding his superiors' expectation. There are tremendous historic parallel between what happened to the Jewish people during the Second World War, during the Holocaust, and what is happening to the Uyghur people. Even if you pick up some of the images, transporting Uyghur detainees on train, it reminds you the scenes in Auschwitz and Dachau. When you read about the Uyghur woman's hair utilized for commercial purposes, you can't help but think what happened to the Jewish woman. When you look at forced labor products being used to beef up Chinese political economy, it also reminds you what happened to the Jewish woman. When when you read about a targeted attack on Uyghur women and children, it reminds you the same experience that Jewish women have gone through throughout the history. So it appears from the talking points, it appears from the public statements, it appears from the propaganda lines that they're using to justify. The Chinese government appeared to find a final solution to the so-called Xinjiang problem.
Can you talk about the journey you and the organizations you're affiliated with have gone through to bring these events into public awareness? And how have your personal connections to these events motivated you to become an activist, or to be talking about these things?
Someone who's I've been working on Uyghur human rights nearly 2 decades now. It will be disingenuous for me to say that I know this was coming. I don't think anyone was even remotely thinking that it would get this bad. I don't think anyone who follows China or travels to China, do business with China, engage in diplomatic issues with China, expected that Xi Jinping would to this kind of brutality, commit this kind of crime against humanity in a daylight on World's Watch. So initially, much like the rest of the world, Uyghur supporters, China observers, I was in disbelief. I refused to accept that never again is happening again in China on our watch. I knew that throughout the history, the Uyghurs have been subject to all types of repression. Anytime when a government repress or attack you or punish you based on your religious belief, that is crime against humanity. Whenever the government focuses on your religious belief, that is a precursor for genocide. I knew that there is something horrific were happening based on what I've heard, based on what I read, based on what I experienced as a Uyghur individual, even living in freedom. So we reach out. You may find this incredible that in early 2018, we were looking for a platform, a venue, or access to microphone to tell these horrific stories, reaching to the shores of the United States or Europe, even Australia. And because of this, because of the difficulty to get access to the information, both through journalistic ways or individually, it was impossible to get first-hand information. So to our benefit, the satellite images released by a Canada-based activist, Chinese activist, and also the investigative reporting done by Australian, English, American journalists start telling the stories. And also something significant happened in 2008 that Kazakh citizens of Kazakhstan who were formerly Chinese citizens start returning to the, leaving the camp and managing to return to Kazakhstan. And they gave interviews to Western media that also helped. And also in summer 2018, the UN Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination publicly challenged the Chinese government for access, for information, calling it no rights zone up to million. American lawyer Gay McDougall famously challenged Chinese government at that international event. And then the world started paying attention. And then the United States government, through its own means and ways, through getting more information. In summer 2019, Pentagon official Randy Shriver told the reporters that his agency believes that there are up to 3 million Uyghurs have been locked up. And then troves of information being released, secretive documents being released in late 2019. And then 2020, oddly, has been a very successful year for the campaign, particularly with the historic, unprecedented legislative and policy responses that we have seen starting May. United States government, for the first time in Uyghurs' human history, legislated and enacted Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act that was signed into law in June. And then around the same time, United States Department of Commerce sanctioned or start sanctioning, we're adding entities to the entity list. Now, as of today, we have about 48. We have 48 Chinese entities have been added to the Commerce Department's blacklist, and then two sanctions been announced. One was against 4 Chinese officials who have been architect and leader in these atrocities, and also Commerce Department, the U.S., the current administration imposed a global Magnitsky sanction against the Chinese entity, a paramilitary called Xinjiang Production Construction Corp, XPCC, that has 800,000 shell companies around the world. And also we have recently managed to make a huge progress on Forced Labor Prevention Act, which also passed with almost unanimous consent in the House of Representatives, now under consideration in the Senate. So, and also we've been also asking for global collaboration, calling the Australian government, Canadian government, Western European governments to join the effort. Several days ago, we've seen the fruit of it, that 39 countries, led by Germany, signed a letter, joint letter, demanding, that includes Australia as well, demanding the Chinese to allow unfettered access. So we're making progress. I recently, I end this, and I will stop after this. I have spoken with some civil rights lawyers in the United States, and they are admiringly telling me that the progress that the Uyghur movement made in such a short period of time has been breathtaking. So a horrific crime being committed against the Uyghur people. We're talking about China's genocidal policies. We're talking about 4 times the size of the District of Columbia population. DC has only about 750,000 people living there, being locked up in the modern day concentration camps. But on a policy, legislative, a societal front, I think it's fair to say that we have made tremendous progress.
Thank you. Realistically, in your mind, what are the possibilities for how the situation might pan out over the next 5 to 10 years? And I guess we're just wondering if there's anything in your mind that will be able to change the course of action that the Chinese authorities are taking against the Uyghur people.
The Chinese government, that's an excellent question. The Chinese government does not have a habit or decency to admit their mistakes. As you may know, they have not even recognized that killing millions of their own people in the Tiananmen Square in 1989 was a mistake. To this day, they have not acknowledged. So it will be naivete for me to think that Xi Jinping wakes up one morning and said, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. What can I do to help? This is not going to happen. But what will happen is that either Chinese make it even worse because the international community is still tiptoeing and dancing around this issue. I mentioned that 39 country joint letter. That shouldn't be something that I would be delighted or pleased to mention even. We're talking about genocidal policies being effectively implemented, carried out. We have entered year 4. This started in late 2016 with the arrival of Chen Zhenguo to the Communist Party leadership position. And we have not seen countries recalling ambassadors. We have not seen UN convening emergency session. We haven't seen a resolution tabled at the UN. We haven't seen countries, the parliaments in Canberra, in Ottawa, in London, or elsewhere, legislating legislative mandates to go after those criminals committing this So basically, the never again ring shallow because of the failure by the international community. So that has given a wrong message to the Chinese authorities. They still think that they can get away with this. They still think that they will be successful, breaking Uyghur families, breaking Uyghur spirit, and destroying this proud nation, a Uyghur nation. So it is on us to stop this. It is on us to use our freedom, use our resources, use our democratic process to pressure our elected officials to take a tougher stance. This is a non-controversial issue. I worry because I worry that either Chinese wins or loses in this criminal process. Both bad news for the Uyghur people. If they even close the camp today, if they release those millions of people to the societies, they're broken. Even the Chinese government, a security official told the Frontline documentary that they fooled people into thinking that they will be educated in these camps. Now they're broken. They're gone mad. If they release them to the society, they will become a social criminals. They're even admitting it. So if they fail, if their indoctrination, this human re-engineering project fails, what are they going to do with the people they locked up in the camps? There have been a disturbing news that they built crematorium around the camps. So history is repeating itself in a very, very strange and disturbing way. So I call on the international community to stop treating this as another human rights atrocities. This is affecting everybody's life. If never again means anything to you, if you believe in that no one should be punished or exterminated or subject to human re-engineering or human engineering based on the ethnicity and religion, it's past time for action.
Thank you, Nury. That's some really powerful things that you've said today. We really appreciate you taking the time to share those thoughts with us. And just again, a reminder for everyone to send through your questions to Gabby and Rebecca, and we will be asking you some questions later on in the evening. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Stephen Smith. Dr. Stephen is the Finchi Viterbi Executive Director of the USC Shoah Foundation and holds a UNESCO Chair on Genocide Education. Smith founded the UK Holocaust Centre in Nottinghamshire, England, and co-founded the AUJS Trust for the Prevention of Crimes Against Humanity and Genocide. Smith has served as a producer on a number of film and new media projects, including Dimensions in Testimony and the virtual reality project The Last Goodbye. In recognition of his work, Smith has become a member of the Order of the British Empire and received the Interfaith Gold Medallion. He also holds 2 honorary doctorates and lectures widely on issues relating to the history and collective response to the Holocaust, genocide, and crimes against humanity. I'm just going to hand over to you, Stephen.
Kelly, thank you. And Nury, thank you very much for your very informative and personal and impassioned introduction to the circumstances that the Uyghur are in right now. I'm going to pull the lens back just for a few moments and look at this situation from a couple of different angles. The first one is going to be more historical, and I want to ask, we've just heard Nury saying in a very clear way to us that history is repeating itself. And I want to sort of ask the question, so is history repeating itself, and how do we identify that? Second thing I want to do is to look at what is happening to the Uyghur right now through the lens of the United Nations Genocide Convention, and to ask the question, is genocide happening, and what do we do about that? So let me just start, first of all, by sharing a screen with you, which I think Rebecca's going to let me do in a second. The USC Shoah Foundation has 55,000 testimonies of survivors of genocide. Over 50,000 of them are Jewish survivors of the Holocaust. And we also have in the collection testimonies of genocides from about 10 other different genocides that have taken place from as early as the beginning of the 20th century with the Armenians, right up until more recently the experiences of the Rohingya who fled Myanmar a couple of years ago. and even actually interviews with Kurdish refugees who were fleeing out of Syria, northern Syria last year. And so the Shoah Foundation's archive is an ongoing archive of collections of voices of people who have experienced or are experiencing genocide in real time. I'm going to turn to one of those individuals, just to let you know that we have 55,000 testimonies, as I mentioned a second ago, of which, excuse me 1 second, I can't find my desktop. 1 minute. I'll just go to the desktop. Excuse me 1 second. That's my previous event. 1 second. There we go. So 55,000 testimonies in the Shoah Foundation's archive, and among them is, I apologize, I had this open just a second ago. Of course, I have now accidentally closed it. My apologies, folks. I'm just going to skip this. Among those 55,000 people, one of them was a gentleman by the name of George Papaniak. George Papaniak survived the Holocaust in Greece. What I was going to show you was a minute of his testimony, where he says in his testimony, in response to a question, what is your message for the future? He says that just because the Nazis have gone does not mean that evil is gone in this world. And that we should all be engaged. He uses the French term engagé. He says we all should be engaged in the world in which we live. And that we all have a responsibility. And if we take the responsibility of the past seriously, then we can make a difference in the world, and that we should take that as a call to action. George Papaniak said that in 1995, when he gave his testimony to the Shoah Foundation. He died a few years ago. He had no idea that we would be on this call talking about the Uyghur. And yet that is exactly what he was saying, is that there are some eternal truths about human behavior that are negative, in which we have a propensity towards committing evil acts against minorities who are vulnerable, but that we also have the equal opportunity as people who are actors in the world to be able to defend ourselves and our civilization, and to defend those who are in this time of great need. So from this archive of humanity, what you get is not only a look back into the past, but a look into who we are as a humanity. In fact, I think more than anything, the survivors of genocide give us a great deal of instruction at this time when we think about what is happening to the Uyghur, to be able to put together more of an insight into the causes and consequences of genocide, and in particular, what we might do to act in this situation. I've told the story many times about one of my heroes, a gentleman by the name of Armin Wegener. Armin Wegener was a German, and in 1915 he found himself during the First World War in Ottoman Turkey and in the Ottoman Empire in an area called Anatolia. And what he saw was Armenian people being taken out into the desert, marched into the middle of nowhere, put on trains, and deported from their homes, and he was watching the Armenian genocide unfold. He did not know that that was a genocide. What he knew was that what he was seeing at that time rang alarm bells for him. And so he went into the desert on the weekends and he photographed what he has seen, what he saw. He was actually in the German armed forces. He was in the medical corps. And he'd chosen to be in the medical corps because he was a pacifist. So he already had this sort of frame of mind. But in fact, virtually every photograph that you have seen of the Armenian genocide was taken by one man and one camera. And what he was doing, he was documenting in real time what he was seeing, because he knew that the atrocity that was occurring under darkness. It was occurring under the fog of war. And he could also see that it was highly structured and government run. And so his defense for the Armenian people was just to use his camera. A camera ultimately that got used as in the courts of law after the First World War, when in fact there were trials to impugn the Ottoman Turks for their genocide against the Armenians. But it didn't stop there. Armin Wegner then took a train from Moscow to Odessa because he felt that what he was seeing in the Soviet Union was so oppressive that it would result in mass human rights abuses. And terms crimes against humanity and human rights was only just becoming into our language, and the word genocide did not even exist at that particular point in time. And he wrote a book called Five Fingers Over You. Five Fingers Over You was published the same year as Mein Kampf in Germany and was on the bestseller list with Mein Kampf in 1924. It was a novel. And he predicted what happened in Stalinist Russia years before it did, and basically said there is no way that you can have a regime with this ideology that won't result in the mass destruction of human life. April 1st, 1933, he was back in Munich. Of course, the Nazis had been in power for about 10 weeks at this point, and there was the first anti-Jewish boycott. Armin Wegner sat down and he wrote a letter. That's all he did. So he had his camera in 1915-17. This time it's his pen. He sits down and he writes a letter to Adolf Hitler, the Fuhrer. What you did to the Jews of Germany today through this boycott, you did to me as a German. And every free-minded, open-thinking German, like me, we're going to rise up and we're going to stop you. Because if you do not stop, then not only will it result in the destruction of European Jews, Germany's Jews, it will result in the permanent disgrace of Germany forever. He wrote this in April 1933. Not a single Jew had been deported to a single concentration. Well, actually, that's not true. Dachau had opened the day before, and Oranienburg opened 2 weeks before that. But deportation, mass deportation, had not started. Concentration camps were literally 2 weeks old at that point. And he raised the alarm bell. Armin Wegner is the only person to have been awarded Righteous Among the Nations at Yad Vashem who never saved a single Jewish life. Because the criterion is you have to save a Jewish life to be considered for Righteous Among the Nations. And the reason for that is, it turns out he was the only person among 60 million people in Germany that day who said, stop. In my name, stop. So Wegner, to me, going back in history, is a highly instructive individual. He then, by the way, spent time in 7 concentration camps himself, very narrowly escaping with his life. It's a highly instructive individual for our conversation today, because Armin Wegner called it 3 times: Armenia, Soviet Union, and the Holocaust. And what you see through his work is this: history does not repeat itself. So we have to stop saying that. But the causes of genocide follow patterns. And we have to be aware of what those patterns are. If we're looking for the same thing, what we actually do is we get ourselves into an argument about technical terms. And whether or not this is a genocide actually is not the case in point right now. It's important because of the instruments we can use. And I'll come to that in a second. What's important is, what are we going to do about the fact that we know that 1 million people of the Uyghur minority in China have already been subjected to a set of abuses that, whether or not they constitute genocide, which only a court of law ultimately will decide, do demand our attention nevertheless. You see, genocide, the end point of genocide, is mass killing, or no, actually mass murder is a more appropriate term, mass murder, or the decimation of a population. The Genocide Convention, which was instituted in 1948, is very clear. The genocide is not only about the killing of people. We have come to see that through the lens of the Holocaust, for example, because of course the Holocaust was the defining genocide that resulted in the term genocide itself being coined immediately in the aftermath of the Holocaust. And so we see that always retrospectively. The whole point about genocide is it's an unfolding scenario. As Nury just said, he's been working on Uyghur human rights for decades. When we think about what happened to the Rohingya of recent times, it came to our attention because best part of 1 million Rohingya fled from their lives from Myanmar into Bangladesh, across the rivers and across the water to get to safety, at the point at which violent killing, government organized killing, rape, destruction of property, and the conditions which were being created made it absolutely impossible for the Rohingya to continue to live in Myanmar, was the end point of decades of persecution for the Rohingya, which did not rise to the level of which it ultimately became a crisis that the international community then had to take notice of, because 650,000 of them turned up in Katapulong, which is a refugee camp just across the border from Myanmar. So how long do you wait until the crisis gets to the point at which it gets our attention? Now, what we just heard from Nury is actually very encouraging, because there has been a concerted effort, including an open letter which was sent about a month ago, actually, by a group of 30 organizations, including the organization, the AUJS Trust, of which I was a founder, pointing to the very clear evidence that the end point of whatever the policies are in China is the destruction of the Uyghur people. And that doesn't necessarily require us to put the definition on it. The reason we have to put the definition on it is that governments don't act until they're actually forced to do so. And one of the reasons the Genocide Convention exists, it is the Genocide Convention for the punishment and prevention of genocide. And therefore, there is an obligation on the part of member states to oblige to live by that convention and do what they can to prevent that. In addition to that, actually following the genocide in Darfur, there was a concerted effort among the international community and organizations to create a new political norm, which we call the responsibility to protect. And the responsibility to protect picks up from where the Genocide Convention left off, and says, okay, listen, we know that you politicians you don't like to invoke the genocide word, because if you say genocide, you have to do something, and heaven forbid that you do something. So therefore, we just do everything we can to skate around that. Actually, the political norm now is the following. If there is a civilian population which is at threat from its government, then the governments of the world and those who are part of the United Nations have a responsibility to protect them, irrespective of international sovereignty. Because the argument was, we can't interfere in the affairs of another country. And now that political norm tells us, oh, actually, not only can you actually must, because otherwise you are not fulfilling your duty as a part of the international community. So these norms exist, and they have grown out of now what is actually, I would say, a century of developing understanding of the trajectory that leads to genocide. So let's just talk for a second about patterns. I want to go back again to the Holocaust for a second. I walked into an antiquarian bookstore in England 10 years ago. I had my little kids with me, and they were all running around, and I couldn't really concentrate in this bookstore, but I just saw on the spine of this book, it said, "The Yellow Spot, the Destruction of Europe's Jews." So I'm a Holocaust scholar, so of course I just pulled it off the shelf. I'd never seen the book before. I didn't even open it because I was trying to handle these children that were doing whatever they were doing. So I just bought the book, put it in the bag, went home, stuck it on the bookshelf. A few months later, I should have a look at that. I opened the book. To my absolute surprise, this book was published in 1936. The Yellow Spot, the Destruction of Europe's Jews. I went, how could this have been published in 1936? It's a book about the Holocaust. So I go through it, 235 pages, in which the way at that point, from 1933 to 1935, which is when the book was obviously being authored, they broke down, the authors broke down the various laws, constraints, and institutional and ideological legislation, regulation that had been imposed on the Jews. And they interviewed people about what the implication was of those regulations on their lives. And the only conclusion the authors could draw was that there is no feasible way that this community can survive this. It will result in the destruction of the Jewish community, because everything is set up in order for that to take place. When we look back at the Holocaust, we say, well, you know, and very often the sort of analysis is, well, because it was unprecedented, you couldn't see it coming. But the victims can see it coming, because the difference between those of us who look on from the outside and those of us who are experiencing it from the inside is one of, it's a completely different experience. Because when a government that is ideologically motivated to destroy you acts, and in this particular case, sets up a framework, including, you know, we saw through those cables that Nury mentioned that there was a manual produced for the running of the camps. So the point at which you are organized enough to set up over 1,000 different re-education camps, and you produce a manual, this is not that well known, but actually the SS were very good at doing manuals as well. And they had a manual for the running of Dachau in 1933. You can see exactly how structured it was. And so when Nury talks about the echoes of the past, he's not wrong in this point at all, in that we have to look at what are the patterns of behavior that governments have when they are suppressing a particular population, and when you know ideologically they intend to destroy that population. And so what you're not looking for is the same thing. What you're looking for is like things that look like a government has got a pattern of behavior that results in the exclusion of that group. People think about genocide as being mass murder, but actually what it is it's exclusion that's taken to its final endpoint. And so what you have is this slippery slope, this very slow process in which not only the outside world, but the victims themselves accommodate to the situation that they face themselves in. Because they are disempowered, they have to keep accommodating. And while the victimization is occurring, they've got to cope with the fact that they have people spying on them in their homes, or, as we were just hearing a moment ago, are using artificial intelligence and are actually looking at downloads of apps on people's phones to see what their behaviors are, and then deciding based on the apps they have on their phones, in the case of the Uyghur, whether or not they are being so-called subversive. And if they are being subversive, then they'll require re-education. And re-education in this case means taking away their religious identity, their cultural identity. It means them becoming ideologically aligned with the regime itself. And the intention is ultimately the word is often used, cultural genocide. I don't like the term cultural genocide, because what it does, it puts a kind of a veneer on it. Either it is genocidal or it is not. And if it is genocidal in nature, then you have to treat it as if it is genocide itself, even if you can't call it at this point that, because you don't have enough evidence for that. And so what there is happening right now is a movement also within the scholarly world to bring together a number of both legal scholars and academicians that focus on the issue of genocide, in order to be able to do a study of all of these facts and patterns that we're seeing and have been seeing over the last few years, to make a very clear determination that may not have the, at this point, the weight of law, because it has not yet been tried, but to actually say, in the case that you were to bring this evidence to the International Criminal Court, would it have the weight of genocide? Because we need to be able to say that clearly, and we need to be able to say that with all of the facts that Nury has already presented to us, but to put that in front of the bodies that can make a real difference to it. And I'll make a final comment, because I know you probably all have questions about this. So what can one do about this? I'll go back first of all to Armin Wegner. She can write a letter. Yeah, that letter has stood the test of time since 1933 till now. For me, that letter is still a motivation for what I do every single day at USC Shoah Foundation, because what I saw there is Armin Wegner died not knowing he was one of the giants of the 20th century, in absolute obscurity. Many of you will be hearing his name for the first time today, which is why I always talk about him, by the way. Because for me, the people that actually often work alone and in silence are those that are actually having the most impact, even if you don't even know it. And so for our work today, first thing that you have done is that you've put time aside this evening to convene, to get together, to talk about this, to show that you're committed. That is actually the first thing. Second thing is get knowledgeable, read, listen to what Nury said. I'm sure he can send us more resources. I think that knowing what happened is really important. Final thing is this. When you look at what many Holocaust survivors say about their experiences during the Second World War and in the camps, one of the things that they talk about a lot is the sense of being abandoned. The world abandoned us. We hear this so very often. What does that actually mean? Well, actually, human beings are very resilient, and that will go true. That is absolutely true for all the Uyghur are going through this right now. While I am extremely sorry for what they're going through, I never ever have pity for the victims of genocide and mass violence, because they don't want pity. What they need is your voice. What they need is for you to be present. If you pity them, you belittle them, because actually they are, I know, I have not met anybody that's been in one of the Uyghur re-education camps yet. I'm sure that will happen at some point. But one thing I know is that what I'm going to find is highly resilient, thoughtful human beings who've gone through this and through this hell that they've gone through, been traumatized by it, but will come out of it on the other side of it as people that can give us guidance and insight and be our teachers and mentors to what has happened. What they do need is to know that they have not been abandoned, that there is a voice out there. In our connected world that we live in, word gets out. And they only need to know that one person has tweeted, WeChatted, whatever it might be, and word goes around, people are listening, people care. And when you're in the middle of all of this, that actually is the hope that you need to get through. And so I want to thank you, all of you, for being on this tonight and for AUJS for putting this together, because actually this is the beginning point that helps them. The rest of it, in terms of the technicalities around genocide, that was going to go on for some time, I am sure.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That was extremely insightful, and I think you really helped us understand how we can help and help the Uyghur people at this time. I'm just going to pass over to Rebecca, who's going to be asking some questions to Nury and to you, just regarding the conversation we've just had now.
Thanks, everyone. We've got a lot of questions from you all, so hopefully we can get through as many as possible. So to start us off, this will be directed to both of you. What's the most tangible and effective action we as Australian citizens can take on this? And more specifically, we have quite a few university students attending tonight. So do you have any specific course of action that university students can adopt? And also, a few people have asked for anything we should be requesting from our leaders to put pressure on the Chinese government to stop this regime. So I know you've both touched on some of this about taking action in your previous answers, but we'd love to hear anything else you have to add. So Nury, would you like to start us off?
We'll just unmute you first.
I'd like to begin by thanking Dr. Smith for those incredibly thought-provoking educational remarks. I learned so much, and it helped me to realize that what I can say to get people's attention by listening to you has made it much more meaningful. As to what to do, there are a lot we can do. And Dr. Smith just mentioned a few things that you can do as an individual. But I would think that more can be done. Three things that I like to advocate for you to use your own individual capacity to work on or collectively work on. One is to recognize that in the daylight, something horrific is happening. It just bothers me so much that some government and some organizations, some media entities always ask, how do we know? What do we know? And what kind of evidence do you have? Oh, that's, yeah, cultural genocide. That's a democratic genocide. Yeah, I agree with Dr. Smith wholeheartedly. No adjective is required or needed. You either do it or don't say it or don't say it. So just a few days ago, the National Security Advisor to the United States President said genocide-like things are happening. That is also not very accurate. So the recognition is extremely important. Feigning ignorance, going business as usual is untenable, number one. Number two, we need to call on, call out even some government officials, including Scott Morrison, including Donald Trump, including future President of the United States, whoever that might be, including Justin Trudeau, to talk. Angela Merkel, for example. I worked with late Congressman Tom Lantos. God bless him. He is an amazing, beautiful soul. Was the only Holocaust survivor served in the U.S. Congress. I mean, maybe the last one and the first one, because we're losing Holocaust survivors. I don't think that there will be another congressman. We need someone like him with moral authority to show a leadership. We live in a leaderless world today. So, calling China out in a very high level position, using the bully pulpit, using the platforms, the access that they have to raise it, not privately, is another thing that we can expect our governments to do. And third, the governmental actions are extremely important, either individually or collectively. Individually, Australian Parliament should swiftly pass the Magnitsky Sanction or Magnitsky Act that has been in consideration since late 2018, where I was visiting Canberra. It has not been done. The countries like the UK, Canada, Estonia, the others already have similar mechanism, should use it. If you don't use the law, it's almost like the ones that the Chinese have in Beijing. It's the same thing. You have to use these laws, like the United States has done. And finally, we have a great opportunity to pressure the International Olympic Committee to renegotiate their terms with China for the 2022 Winter Olympics. The international community glorified, legitimized Nazi Germany, Hitler, in 1936. Similar mistakes was made in 2008 for the Beijing Summer Olympics. And the same mistake is about to be repeated. It's unconscionable for global athletes from the international community to compete in Beijing while China is holding up millions of ethnic religious minority, shipping tainted products all around the world produced by modern slaves and polluting the global supply chain, and sending Uyghur women's hair for beautification of some of the people around the world. I mean, this is all wrong. So, those are the things that as a society, as a government, as a country that we could do. And in your situation, the Australian government has been mild in its response, but it could do more. At least 5 Australian kids caught up in this. At least 15 Australian permanent residents have either been detained or caught up in China, could not return to Australia. If a country, a government cannot protect their own citizens, what do you expect? What do you expect from others to do? So, it's a small thing. Call your representative, call your government officials to get those 5 babies back to Australia. They're Australian. They're not supposed to be separated from their family members.
Can I just add a couple of things to that? First of all, on a personal level, just on this call today, commit to doing one thing after this call. That's the first thing. Whatever it might be, learn something, tweet something, say something, do something, but commit to doing one thing, because once you start to activate, it becomes easier. If you absorb this in as, wow, that was really interesting what Nury said, I'm so distressed about that, and then just keep it inside your head, nothing will happen. It's a bit like exercising. I think I'm exercising every day, but actually until I actually get in the gym and actually do something, I'm not really exercising. I'm just thinking it's happening. It won't happen if you don't do it, first thing. Secondly, humanize this story. What is happening to the Uyghur is a process of dehumanization. It's very structured dehumanization. And the telling of the human story is really important. And I'm sure Nury can help us to find some of those stories and some of those faces. I remember we have the Shoah Foundation chairman, Lee Lieberman, is from Melbourne and is on the call, I think, today somewhere. And I remember she and I had a conversation about the Rohingya. And she called me and said, what are we going to do? And we went and we filmed their stories, like literally as it was happening. The result of that is we filmed over 100 people as it was occurring. Those testimonies now, and all we were trying to do was just humanize the story, put a face to the story so we could tell it. And then those stories were then told on CNN and then they became available. So now it wasn't a faceless mass. It was somebody with a name, somebody with a story, somebody with children. And Nury, maybe you can help us all to find those stories that we can tell, because it's really important that then you use that to tell the stories. That's then when you can get your social media going. Many of you represent organizations too. Or just thank you for putting this on. I see Board of Deputies, you're involved in this. I see my friend Sue Hampel from Monash University. Hi, Sue. Our universities can say things as organizations. Use the organizational structures that you have as well as your own personal ones, because power comes when people speak collectively. Otherwise, I think Nury's covered it very well.
Thank you.
Thank you both. For the next question. So in 2019, 50 countries signed a letter to the UN Human Rights Council in praise of China's actions towards Uyghurs. Why is there so little support from governments around the world? Stephen, would you like to start us off?
Well, I just want to say what's amazing about this letter is not only are they not denouncing China, they are supporting China and its policies towards the Uyghur. It's almost like it's so against the evidence when this group of 54 countries said what they said. Obviously, this is a geopolitical statement. And I think what tends to happen is, and I'll make this my point on this, and I'm sure Nury has got more insight from an inside perspective. But what tends to happen is, as the political temperature goes up around potentially genocidal positions, countries harden their positions based on interests. I always remember Yehuda Bauer always says that countries don't have morals, what they have is interests. I have to say, as a young genocide scholar, when I heard him say that 15 years or 20 years ago, I went, okay, that will always be a guiding principle for me when I look at statements like that, which is, what are the interests? Because it won't be about the moral and ethical issues that are underpinning this. And so what you have to do in this situation is be persuasive in the context of those interests and dismantle those interests or the effectiveness of those interests so that you can then start to sway opinion. The second thing is this: you also need to have as Nury said earlier, China's not going to wake up one morning and say, oh, we got this wrong. And the reason is because this has been a highly ideological, highly structured attempt to decimate the Uyghur people from a political perspective all the way through this. However, if you can then start to tip the interests in your balance, and I think the point you made a moment ago, Nury, about the 15 Australians, I had not heard that before. What a good point. Change the interest. And I think that is starting to happen now a little bit as we've gone through 2020. But we have to play almost in two completely different games here. One is the human rights abuses and the highlighting the human story of the Uyghurs, and then you have to play a completely different political game in terms of focusing on what are the interests of the countries that are blocking the kind of legislation and action that we need.
Thank you so much. There's no event, no speaking engagements that I've done in the last 3-4 years that this question didn't come up. It is very difficult question to answer, and also it's deeply disturbing situation. I try to be diplomatic, but I can't be a diplomatic when I talk about this disgraceful League of Nations that are not only looking the other way, but pampering China with lots of compliments. Surprising, the League of Nations that are supporting China includes countries like Palestine, countries like, in Central Asia that also have very strong cultural, linguistic, historic ties to the Uyghur people. Secretary Pompeo said that China has its own league when it comes to human rights violations. As Stephen said, that it's changing. Back in 2019, it was 22 countries, but now it's 39 countries. We have at least 2 Muslim countries, Kosovo and Albania, joined the effort. But the other side is remaining to be still vocal. Even someone like MBS, groomed to be the custodian of 2 holiest mosques for the Muslim people, didn't even bother to ask Xi Jinping what's wrong with his name. The name Muhammad is banned. If you have a name, any Abrahamic name that is from Quran or Hadith, you have to change it. It's a sign of extremism. The Uyghur people cannot even greet in a traditional way to say Assalamu alaikum to each other. That is also banned. Anything from that kind of religious aspect of Uyghur life is banned. So why do they do this? As you know, that none of these countries are a Jeffersonian democracy. They are either authoritarian or dictatorship. Allowing that kind of human rights discourse part of government policies to them may stir up a resentment against their own ruling or their own regime. Number one. Number two, sadly, these countries have become China's clientele state, namely Pakistan, for example. Pakistan, I've been interviewing Uyghur survivors and victims for a writing project. I recently talked to a Uyghur mother of 3 who's married Pakistani citizen who ended up spending time in the camps. So the Pakistani government didn't help. Recently, there was an article in LA Times describing a horrific situation for Pakistani individuals whose wife disappeared in the camp. Even in the face of this kind of obvious evidentiary information, Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan still feigning ignorance. Why? Because Pakistan needs China in its conflict with India. And China is a key country for China. Pakistan is a key country for China's implementation of Belt and Road Initiative. So if you look at the map, and if you look at this belt that China built from Asia all the way to north of Africa, there's an economic belt that China is using to buy out silence. And finally, there's some also coercive method. We've been told that Chinese diplomats at the UN, at various capitals, are very, very aggressive, silencing some diplomats who wanted to at least acknowledge there is a problem against their religion. China treats Islam as a mental illness. I have a news for them. I don't think that they can ignore this belligerent, naked attack against their religion. So, and they called the thought virus, the Islamic faith, the practicing religion, as Stephen mentioned, the indoctrination is basically clearing out that virus that the China call comes from a religious faith. So it's sadly 3 things are happening: coercive methods implied by the Chinese government, giving them this disturbing League of Nations supporting the Chinese repression.
And if I could just add, Rebecca, just one sentence to that while we're in this thought process. It's very surprising, actually, that the Muslim world is not more engaged in the issue around genocide prevention more generally. And it's something we do need to encourage. If you think about it, in the very recent history, Kosovo, Bosnia, Darfur, Myanmar with the Rohingya, and now the Uyghur, all Muslim minorities that have been targeted with genocidal policies. And it just makes perfect sense that the Muslim world comes together to say, how can we use our influence for good, but actually it's actually not suiting them, obviously, otherwise they would. And I think we need to do a lot of work there to try and persuade that part of the world to be more engaged. But in fact, that's not happened so far.
Thank you. This might be the last question we get to tonight. So to both of you, what role can countries play in offering Uyghurs refuge and helping those not yet in camps escape before that happens? And is that a viable option? Nury, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have not seen a large number of Uyghurs managing to leave the camp and then manage to leave the country. That is also one of the most disturbing aspects. The Chinese claim that the students, they call students graduating, but graduating to where? Leaving to where? They are end up either going to the labor camps or the actual prison camps. I am a government official here in the United States. Since my appointment to the commission, I've been approached by various groups around the world, either looking for their missing family members or trying to find a country where you can live safely. Going to Australia is not an option for most people. It's very difficult even to get a visa. For Australia, if there's any backlog in an immigration system, administratively that could be speed up. But most of the refugee problem are in the Middle East and in Europe. There are large refugee community in the Middle Eastern countries. Some of them were picked up by the local authorities and deported to China, in the case of UAE, in the case of Egypt. But there are a sizable refugee community in Turkey trying to find a country that they can resettle. Swedish government offered blanket refugee status. Germany, after making one mistake, made public that they're not going to send anyone with a Uyghur name back to China. In the United States, there's a deliberation, consideration to provide one kind of immigration status. There are about 700 to 1,000 asylum applicants in the whole country that have been backlogged because of the crisis in the southern borders. But UN agencies are not helpful. So this refugee settlement, refugee assistance program can be done individually and regionally. So it is an important, if the governments cannot take on China diplomatically, refugee settlement, processing, expedited process of asylum application, other type of things that they can do easily.
Rebecca, I think Nury's answered that really well. There's a couple of things that come to my mind that we have to bear in mind when we think about this. First of all, China is, when it wants to do something, it puts the full force of the state behind it. They've been very successful in curbing the coronavirus because they put everybody behind it to make sure that happened. And if they want to suppress the Uyghur, they'll do exactly the same thing. But some of this is, happening below the radar. One of the things we haven't mentioned today, which it really is important to mention, is forced sterilization and the use of IUDs. The birth rate of Uyghurs is down 30%. And that's because of sterilization and the state enforcing use of IUDs for Uyghur women. That is actually preventing births within the group. And I share that with you because on the one hand, might have this fantasy that Uyghurs can escape and leave. They aren't going anywhere, most of them. The question is, how do we actually help them or shine a light on what is happening? I think one of the things that's so important in genocide prevention is ending impunity. If the Chinese government think that they can operate with impunity, they will. And they do think that. But actually, the more we shine a light on it, the less likely that is to happen. I mentioned a moment ago about the Rohingya project of interviewing Rohingya. The result of that collection of interviews is now those 100+ interviews are now getting used in The Hague towards the prosecution of the Myanmar government. That hasn't happened yet. The fact that those voices from within the experience can then become the voices that end impunity on that situation is really important. And I think what I would like to do this evening on behalf of the Shoah Foundation, Nury, is to commit to say, if there's anything that we can do to tell this story, to enable the voices to be heard and to end impunity, I think even if they can't get out of there, there's no escape route, nevertheless, that can perhaps shine a light and give some hope and ensure that they're more humanized. And we just welcome everybody that's participating this evening to participate in that, including reaching out to the Uyghur that live in Australia, because the best thing for us to do is to do this as communities together.
Thank you. Rebecca, can I add something? Two other things that you could do to help. One, this has been actually produced or reported by Australian think tank ASP, Australian Strategic Partnership Institute. Over 83 global brands have been allegedly using forced labor. So the cotton products that you have been buying, sneakers made sold by Adidas, Puma, Nike, will likely been produced by modern day Uyghur slaves. So as a consumer, if you see anything like it made in China, cotton products, the chance of you buying Uyghur forced labor produced products is pretty high. More than 80% of the cotton products made in China are sourced in Xinjiang. And more than 20% of the cotton products produced and sold around the world are sourced in Xinjiang. So because of this polluted global supply chain situation, it's very difficult to trace the custody or the source. But what you can do is, if you see a cotton product, at least you may need to put it back on the shelf. United States government keep seizing products at the border, including the hair products that I mentioned. It was 13 tons, one shipment. But the question is, how many shipments that they send around the world? CNN just did an amazing report. If you go to CNN.com, Uyghur here, you will see what are the countries that are being sent. Especially the communities with darker hair are vulnerable for this kind of tainted products. Just give you one quick stat. From April 2019 to April 2020, the products coming to the United States, at least from Xinjiang, increased by 200%, 250%. So we're talking about this old scrutiny, reporting, screaming, yelling at the United States Congress for not doing enough. The US is imports from that region increased by 250%. China being Australia's largest trading partner, I'm sure that you are inadvertently buying similar products. So with that, I want to thank you. Stephen is absolutely right. You're doing exactly the right thing. I am deeply touched by your commitment to help us to stop the genocide.
Thank you. And also thank you so much to the audience for asking all of these questions. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get through them all, but I encourage you all to keep learning about this issue, as well as educating others about what you've learned this evening. I'll now pass back to Galit to close off the event.
Thanks, Rebecca. And I think we will also be sending out an email with some resources for those of you who have signed up today, just so that you can think about how you want to enact these things in the future and help the Uyghur people. I guess I'd just like to thank Nury and Stephen for joining us and for sharing your knowledge and your insights and your expertise with us. Nury, thank you for giving us all that detail and for helping us understand a bit more about what is happening to the Uyghur people. I think I speak for all of us when I say that, you know, we're all very touched and horrified as well by what we're hearing, and we do want to take a stand for the Uyghur people. And so we appreciate you, you know, speaking on behalf of your people. And Stephen, thank you for sharing a bit more about how we can be active, talking about testimony and rehumanizing and giving people a voice. I think that's really powerful. And obviously in our community, we value testimony and talking about the history of our people. And I think that's something we can take through in how we approach this issue as well, sharing those stories and helping spread their voices as well. So thank you for that. I'd also just like to thank Romy Rudovitz and Liam O'Callaghan and the rest of the team from the Jewish Board of Deputies, as well as everyone at AUJS who helped put this event together. And a big thank you to Rebecca Ellenson and Gabia Gossin for all their work in organizing tonight. And thank you all again for joining us. It means a lot. And yeah, thank you. Have a lovely evening, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.